if you're thinking about horror, think about, well, what scares me? You know, I have a recurring nightmare of a giant like tsunami wave coming towards me, which is also something James Cameron had as well. And that's why he did The Abyss, right? That was the ending, The Abyss.
All right, this is the Story Series podcast where we tell the stories behind the people. Daniel Calvisi, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Brandon.
I'm thrilled to talk to you. It's customary, I always read a brief introduction for those who might not know who you are. Mm-hmm. You are a screenwriter, a script doctor, writing coach, and author of several books on screenwriting, including The Story Maps, How to Write a Great Screenplay, Story Maps TV drama, The Structure of the 1 Hour Television Pilot. Your work has really become the go-to resource for thousands of aspiring and professional writers, including me. So
I hope so.
Yes, absolutely. When we were talking a little bit before, but I mentioned my manager, Jeff Agassi, who swears by your work. He was the one that turned me on to your books a couple of years ago. So when you reached out and we got a conversation and made this podcast happen, it was just surreal that just to be talking to you, because when you reached out, your book was on my shelf already. So once again, all that is to say, thank you.
That's great. That's great. You're welcome. I would love to know when anybody in the industry reads and likes my book and recommends it. So whenever I hear back, that's great.
But before we get to that, just as a way to get to know you better, mm-hmm. I like to start with origin stories. And so if you could, where did you grow up?
So I grew up in the Bay Area in San Jose, California, which is like Silicon Valley. But I was born in Michigan. So I came from the Midwest, grew up in California, spent a lot of time in Santa Cruz, California, which is like the beach town that's closest to the Bay Area. And I went to NYU, and then I stayed in New York for 10 and a half years. And then I've been in LA now for like almost 18 years. So I've always been kind of a well-rounded person, like jack of all trades. And I think it informs a lot of my work, and being able to relate to people is that I've lived on the West Coast, the East Coast, and the Midwest.
There's very different cultures.
So, yeah, totally. And I've been exposed to a lot of different people. Living in New York, I mean, you get people from all over the world, all walks of life. And LA is a melting pot too. So I feel like that helps with my writing and with my coaching too, that I can relate to people. I love to meet new people. I love to work with international clients and just people I wouldn't normally run into. So that's me.
Were you an especially creative child? Like, were you a film lover growing up?
I was. My first thing was drawing. Like, I was the good drawer, as the kids called me. And I really got into comic books. So I was obsessed with comic books, and I wanted to be a comic book artist. That was my total dream. But then in high school, I borrowed a video camera, and I shot my first little short film in my backyard. And I called it Danbo, because I was a fan of Rambo. And I had like camos and like a fake plastic Uzi.
That's great.
So made up this stupid little story where I was rescuing a guy from a POW camp with my friends. And then that night, I watched Platoon, which is the exact opposite, but also like a war film.
Yep.
And I was so blown away. And it was the first time I watched a film from the perspective of the director. Because I was like there were scenes in the jungle, and like the camera was moving smoothly. And I was like, are they putting like dolly tracks in the jungle? Because I didn't know that the Steadicam existed, because I was like 15 years old. But just seeing it from that perspective, I was like, how did they do this? Because even just using like a VHS camcorder in your backyard, you have to make decisions where to put the camera. And like the camcorders had that weird thing where when you stop recording, it rolls back. So if you don't, after you call cut, if you don't wait a couple seconds, you're going to lose the last few seconds of your previous shot. And so I didn't know that until I shot a few shots, and I was like watching it back in the little viewfinder, and I was like, oh man, there's this issue with the camera. But that was like learning how to be a director, And so I got obsessed with film, and that's what I wanted to do. So I wanted to go to film school, and in film school gravitated towards screenplays and towards writing.
And what film school was it?
So I first went to UC Santa Barbara for 2 years, and then I transferred to NYU for film.
Okay, so West Coast to East Coast.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, and that's a great school.
Yeah, yeah. It was really cool to be there.
And what did you learn about yourself when you were there? You said you started to gravitate towards screenwriting.
Yeah. One of the big reasons was every little short film I made, there was always some technical problem or like some other crew member screwed it up. Like my cameraman reloaded the same roll of film twice into the same camera, so it was double exposed. And I'm a perfectionist, and I hate when there's like technical issues. And so I was like, if you're directing a film, if you're making a film, first of all, it's really expensive. Like kids were spending like $20,000, $30,000 on their thesis film, didn't have the money, and you have to rely on all these other people. And I was like, when you write a screenplay, you don't have to rely on anybody. It's your baby, it's your masterpiece, and you make all the decisions. And I took a screenplay analysis class that I really liked, and that kind of proved to be the basis of the skills that I then used as a reader when I got out of school.
And when you were getting close to graduating, what was your plan? Is that when you were able to find a job as a reader for those studios out there?
That took a while. So my first thing, I had an internship at a company. It was more a post-production company. They were renting Avid and Lightworks editing systems to movies that were shooting in New York. And it was a company, it was co-owned by Robert De Niro's Tribeca Productions company. And it was in the Tribeca Film Center in Tribeca, New York. So that was kind of my first job, an internship, and then it became a very low-paying job. And then I kind of worked my way into being a reader. I begged this producer to let me do coverage on a couple of his scripts. He did. So then I had a couple coverage samples. So then I called up New Line and Miramax and these companies, and I said, do you want to see some of my samples? And then they gave me a sample script to do coverage on, and kind of like the test, for the job.
And
then
for those who don't know, coverage is when you read a screenplay and you summarize it, and then you give like your kind of short review or your comments of it, right?
It's like kind of like your book report or your analysis, short analysis about, will this be a fit for my company?
Right, because the dirty secret is most of those executives just don't have time to read every script that they receive, right? So they rely on coverage, people, readers like you at the time, to see what is worth their time.
Yeah,
essentially.
So you're like the first gatekeeper before that.
Yep. And so they give you a test script.
Yeah. So they gave me a test script pretty much at each company. And one of them was, I think the test for New Line was the Truman Show screenplay. And it was great because I didn't know that big twist that he was on a TV show until like page 27.
So was the movie out yet?
It wasn't out yet. So, I mean, this is ancient history. This is like the 90s.
Right. Mm-hmm. So when you received that script, did you know that it was becoming a film, or was it?
I didn't know anything about it.
So it's just a random script to you. You didn't know. Fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And what did you think of it?
I thought it was amazing. Yeah, I thought it was really cool. And it's interesting. I think I mentioned this in my book, that turn, that reveal is so great if you don't know it's coming. And then they made the movie, and they made the mistake of revealing that in the ad campaign. So you knew going in what it was. And I just thought, if they somehow built an ad campaign where you didn't know he was on this TV show, it would have been great. Like The Crying Game, the whole marketing campaign was, there's this big thing, this secret that's going to happen. What is the secret of The Crying Game? And everybody went, and then you had that big surprising moment, which now we'd see coming. I don't know how we didn't see that coming.
Right.
But yeah, I thought maybe they could have gotten a little bit more creative with the ad campaign.
You got to experience that as a reader of the Truman Show.
Yeah, that was really cool.
And did you get that job?
I did. Yeah, that was for New Line.
For New Line.
And I read for them for a little bit.
One of the defining production companies of the 90s, right?
Yeah, I mean, they were doing a lot of really amazing stuff. I mean, yeah, if you look at New Line in the 90s, I mean, things like Fight Club and Seven, and then horror movies that were big. And they really have some cool movies from emerging filmmakers. They took a lot of chances.
What did you see as your career trajectory at that point? What was your goal? What were you looking towards?
My goal was to become a feature screenwriter and to sell a spec. script. That was the boom time of the spec market. And so, I mean, I thought any day now I'm going to sell a spec for 600K, against a $1 million production bonus. I went, and I guess you were that way too, right? Like,
yeah,
that was the goal.
You're reading about all these crazy sales. That's the era of Joe Esterhaus,
Yeah,
too.
Shane
Of
Black
just these, Shane Black just selling these crazy spec scripts for just insane. Every sale was like setting a new record. So you want it. So were you writing in your free time? You were reading scripts professionally, writing in your own time, just doing it.
Yeah. So writing features in my own time, just script after script, and probably rewriting them for too long. I mean, I would sometimes spend years rewriting the same script, which I shouldn't have done. I should have just kept moving, drop this one, keep writing another, keep writing another.
And just knowing now where your career has taken you with story maps, what were your tools back then? There wasn't a you for you back then, right? You're kind of, like you said, you're spending too much time rewriting. What did you feel was missing for you?
Well, so pretty much the big screenwriting book that I learned on was Screenplay by Sid Field.
Yeah.
And I think he had like a super basic beat sheet. It was his paradigm, I think he called it. And it was like, there were like 4 beats that he defined, end of act 1 turn, midpoint, end of act 2 turn, climax, opening at the beginning. And so what I really needed was a more detailed beat sheet. And this was pre-Save the Cat. So I ended up making my own, just from reading so many scripts and from struggling with structure and stuff. And so I made my own beat sheet just based on what works in successful movies. So I ended up kind of using that myself.
Yeah, I mean, that's just such the wisdom that you gain from just reading so many scripts.
Yeah.
Out of the scripts that you read, do you recall how many really moved you?
1 to 3 recommends in my 8 years as a reader, one of them was, because you got to understand, it's not just the story and the writing, it's the fit for your company that you're reading for. One of them was called The Curse by Sam and Ivan Raimi. And it was great, loved it. It was scary and funny. I recognized Sam Raimi's name, right? So he's established in horror, and I was reading for Dimension Films, which made horror films like the Scream movies, right? So they made these kind of films. They had that audience that they were looking to capture. And it was a fun, scary horror comedy from a name writer. And that was a full recommend. I was like, this is right down the alley. This is exactly what you want. And because I think one executive didn't like it, they didn't end up acquiring it. And surprisingly, he didn't get that made for years and years. And it came out as Drag Me to Hell. So it ended up being the movie Drag Me to Hell.
Years later.
Yeah, I think maybe after he made Spider-Man, right? So like he had to become a huge director before he got the money to make this, what is essentially a small horror movie,
You said that you were developing kind of your own beat sheet. Could you talk a little bit about what that looked like? What you were kind of gleaming from reading so many scripts?
Yeah. It was, I knew it was clearly going to be 3-act structure, beginning, middle, end, which is what Sid Field talked about. And Sid Field talked about the importance of the midpoint. And I noticed halfway through, there's always a really big beat. So that separates Act 2 into 2 parts. So I started doing Act 1, Act 2A, Act 2B, and Act 3. And so you basically you're going to have your setup, your introduction, get the main story engine moving as quickly as possible. There's usually something 8 to 10 minutes in, 18 to 20 minutes in. The turn at the end of Act 1 was almost always like page 27 or 28. And I noticed that didn't matter the genre, didn't matter the budget level. It was almost always that way. And I don't know if it's still that way because I don't read scripts for the studios anymore, but you couldn't help but notice that. And then you watch a movie and you're like 26, 27 minutes in is when the turn happens. And which is funny because when Blake Snyder Save the Cat came out, and he said 25 is when you have the break into two. Not to quibble, but it's more 27 or 28. It's not 25, But probably now a generation of writers are going off of that. So I do see movies where it is more minute 25, And I hate to get that particular, but you have to,
Well, every page matters.
Yeah,
I mean,
every page
roughly
matters.
every one page of a script is 1 minute of screen time, and that's the budget right there.
Yeah.
That's what they work off of. So any writer knows every single page matters, whether it's 25, 26. That is important.
Yeah.
So
and a
fascinating.
30-minute or 30-page act one has been universal for decades. That's just, our brains are wired for that for whatever reason. 30 minutes for that first initial big chapter. Doesn't really matter the genre. And you could have a script that breaks all the rules with those page points, but then the resulting film is usually edited that way and has a 30-minute act one.
Yeah. Yeah.
For whatever reason, that kind of works. But I noticed act two, it's so long. I mean, act two is 50 to 60 pages. And there's that dreaded act two problem where it just starts to meander and stuff. So I knew I needed more beats in act two, more signpost moments. And so I found, just from watching films, there's usually something around 38 to 40, 45. And I called that the first trial and first casualty, because there's always a big test to the protagonist, but there's always a failure. They can't be succeeding right away, 40 minutes in. So there's always a big failure. So then you get to the midpoint, and the midpoint is almost always a disaster. I don't like when I see analysts saying that it can be a complete huge win at the midpoint.
Yeah, I just thought of that when you said that, where I've heard sometimes the midpoint can lift up the hero as opposed to, pushing them back down.
Yeah.
But okay, so please continue.
So in my opinion, it's almost always better, and any great film, classic film, well-written film, it's almost always more of a disaster, a low point at the midpoint. Now, it can seem like a high point, like a perfect example is in a romance, let's say Titanic or something. Their first kiss is the midpoint, right? So you think, oh, well, that's a great moment, right? But in a romance, there's problems with the romance, right? So they don't get together at the midpoint. They're engaged to someone else. They're from two different classes. So them actually kissing at the midpoint leads to more conflict because, oh no, their parents don't want them to be together, or one of them's engaged.
I was going to say, that there's complications to follow.
Yeah.
Whereas if they just shook hands and said, let's be friends, then, there's not going to be any conflict after that, right?
Yeah.
It's the fact that they're falling in love that you're like, ooh, I want to watch this, but this is going to be a problem.
Yeah. And it can't be a giant win because they can't win that soon halfway through. You know? So then halfway through, around 75, I noticed in movies and in scripts, 75 minutes in, 75 pages in, there is always a significant moment, and it's usually where the protagonist feels like some surge of strength, and they throw down the gauntlet, and they attack, or they have a strong strike that really comes from within, in which they realize their own power. And so I called it the assumption of power / declaration of war moment. And you see it all the time in movies. And it doesn't have to lead to a success, but it has to be like an emotional success, that they felt their power and they struck against the antagonist, and then that leads to end of Act Two, which was pretty standard.
The ultimate low point.
Right. And that strong turn in direction is going to happen 87, 88. It can be 85. It can be 90. I mean, as I've gotten older, I've relaxed on those page points, and they're not going to chuck your script in the trash if your Act Two ends on 92 versus 90 or something,
But those big moments are always there. At
they're
least
always there, yeah.
For the stories that are really compelling and grab you.
Yeah.
You feel when they're coming and they work. And so you're applying this to your own work and your own writing, and you're getting your scripts out there, but you're still in New York. as a reader at this point, right?
Yeah.
And so when do you start to feel like maybe you need to relocate to the West Coast?
It was probably more an economic thing because 9/11 happened and the economy kind of took a turn. And so I lost some of my reader jobs and I wasn't getting as many classes I was teaching at the new school. So it was kind of an economic thing. And I was like, I feel like maybe my time in New York is done. Let's go back to California. And so I went back to California for a while and stayed with family. And then I moved to Oakland, another place I've lived. And that's where I met my wife and we got married. And then I said, I have to make my big stab to LA. I haven't been there yet. So that's what brought me down to LA. But yeah, I mean, if I was selling specs in New York, I wouldn't have left. But it just seemed like the natural progression of, I think my time as a reader is done. I think I've done as much as I can. I've learned as much as I can. And I need a new chapter
it's time
in my
to take
life.
that to the next chapter.
Yeah.
And so
but I never stopped writing. So I just kept writing.
Yeah. And you come to Los Angeles, and then how is that getting yourself out there, finding a job, supporting yourself? What are you doing?
Well, so by then I was full-time doing my home business as a consultant, script consultant and writing coach. And so that was supporting me. So I knew I was doing that. And I started doing webinars and I was running a writer's website as well. So definitely firmly focused on screenwriting.
And taking your experience as a reader, and now you're making it into your own business. You're the face of it. You're not working for another company. It's for yourself.
Yeah.
And when do you feel like you start to have enough material for your first book?
It was a gradual process where I wrote like kind of white papers or worksheets, and I would give those to my clients. And I would break down movies in a beat sheet and a story map analysis. And it just got to the point where I worked up enough material where I was like, I think this could be a book. And I also wanted that to legitimize me more as a consultant, and as an analyst. So that's when I decided to write my first book, Story Maps: How to Write a Great Screenplay.
Do you approach a publishing house? How do you make those contacts?
At one point, I did meet with potential publishers, and the big thing for me was they said, "Oh, it's not going to come out for another year," and I was like, "But I can put it on Amazon now," and I didn't want to wait another year, so I just did it myself, and I'm glad I did, and I think I probably long run made a lot more money because it's me taking that 70%.
Right.
Than I would have if I signed with a publishing company and took some tiny percentage that they gave me.
Right. And when did you know that this book was really something special, that it was making an impact?
I don't know. I mean, more people would mention it. I would get emails from prospective clients because of the book, So probably that. I would hear from people and they would say, "Hey, how much does it cost to hire you to read my script?" Because I read your book.
And approximately what year was that?
That would have been, I think, like 2010, 2012 were when I first published the first editions of my book.
Yeah. And when you were holding that book, how did it feel?
It felt cool. It felt cool, yeah, to have it, and
right?
see it there. I think there was a confidence boost there, and my parents liked it. My dad liked it because it was like a concrete thing he could point to. My son wrote a book, and there's his name on the book.
Yeah,
because my career has always been kind of nebulous to them. Like, he works with screenwriters, something like that.
It's a weird career to, for a parent to be like, yeah, this is what they do, I think.
Yeah. So it was good to have that concrete thing.
Were you always obviously you're creative, but also very analytical at the same time.
Yeah.
And that unique intersection makes it so you have a knack for breaking down stories across different mediums, because you began doing features, and then with the rise of television, as you had talked about in other interviews, you started to feel this demand for breaking down television shows and television pilots. But just looking back, were you always that analytical?
I think I was actually. And I'll tell you, I just realized this in the last year as I was making up a story map, and it starts with the basic story map, where you break down the main elements and you start with your protagonist and their goals and their characteristics. And I was like, this is just like the character sheets I used to do with Dungeons and Dragons when I was 10 years old. And I used to love those more than playing the game. I thought playing the game of D&D was boring, but making up the character sheet, like, oh, this is a paladin and here's their score. Did you do that as well?
Big D&D guy. Yeah.
And I just love that. And then I loved drawing the character in the little square on the character sheet. Right. And it's like I kind of still do that. I love the breakdown.
That's funny because just hearing you talk about your path, I was kind of an artist first growing up. I was drawing, but I was just kind of plateaued at like mediocre, but I loved it and loved comic books, wanted to do comic books, got into Dungeons and Dragons, loved the character sheets, the character building, the world building, all that. So there, it's, just kind of hovering around just storytelling and just wanting to be in it and near it and do whatever I can to get there. And it sounds like there's a lot of similarities there.
Yeah. And I would notice things about movies that like my friends wouldn't, that other kids wouldn't. Like a big thing was the sleepover birthday parties where you'd rent 2 or 3 movies from the video store. And just, I would notice things that other kids wouldn't.
Like
like in the Goonies, there was that whole sub-theme about we're outcasts, we're the lower class people of this town because the wealthy industrialists were coming in to kind of wipe down their homes and build a new development or something. So that was a whole sub-theme. But most of the kids at my sleepover birthday party, all they remembered was the hunt for the treasure. And it occurred to me, I'm like, what is this thing about? He was saying like, this is our time down here. What does he mean? And I was really intrigued by that, like the emotional element of it that I think other kids didn't notice.
That's fascinating. And that's a great point because you need a certain kind of eye to be able to break it down and then communicate it to other people, which is what you do through your books. And before that, through just your kind of coaching one-on-one. But it does take that kind of specificity, right?
Yeah.
Thinking about the bigger connecting dots in ways other people wouldn't.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the analytical side, but mixed with creative.
Yeah.
So when that book came out, how did it change your life?
I was able to, I went to the ink tip pitch contest and I had a banner with my book cover on it. So it kind of legitimized me in a way. And I think maybe that people look at you as a little bit more legit if you have a book that you've written.
Yeah. And you mentioned leading up to the first book that you finally felt like you had enough material and enough experience to put it into a book. But what did writing a book teach you about yourself and your craft that you didn't know before then?
It was probably a different way of reading. I had to anticipate what would a fledgling screenwriter reading this book be thinking as they read it. What do they think? What questions are they asking? What are they expecting? And then there's a difference between, well, what's my opinion and what is like fact or industry standard or something. And in some cases I had to decide, like, was I going to be a stickler about something in the book and just say, this is me, like I like a 30-page act one, deal with it, or was I going to be a little bit more loose with how I define things?
So learning about your own boundaries in terms of how you want to communicate storytelling structure.
Yeah.
And
what stands am I willing to take? What am I going to die on or live on? And, because you have to live with it because it's in print. So,
right.
If I say something about the Sixth Sense and it's in print, right? But so then 2 years later, someone might be interviewing me and be saying like, you got something wrong about the Sixth Sense, so you better be right before you put it in print.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you were getting close to publishing that book, did you go out to other writers for feedback? Did you have any kind of test readers?
I did, yeah. So I had test readers. I had friends who test read it. I had my uncle who was an English teacher proof it. My wife, who's an editor, she also did copy editing on it and gave me a lot of feedback. And that's a huge thing with, as I'm sure you know, anything you write, you should get people to give you feedback on.
Mm-hmm. Any feedback that was particularly like you had to kind of be convinced to take a note?
Probably, but I can't think of anything
Yeah.
now. But again, I was more of a stickler back then when I wrote my first book than I am now. I'm looser now, especially with like in screenplays, like commentary or voice. I'm a lot looser than I used to be because, as we see, there really are no rules in the end. It's like there are rules, like it needs to be clear. I do think you need a clear slug line. You do need clear scene headings. Some people are like, you don't even need scene headings. Don't worry about it as long as it's clear. I don't think that's the case at all. I want delineation between scenes, and that's because I worked as a reader for years. And the worst thing is when you're just lost and you're confused, and then you have to turn back 2 pages to figure out, oh, have we seen this guy yet before? So there are those like rules that you do want to stick to, but in the end, if it flows and it works, it works,
So when the book came out and it kind of brought you in front of a whole new kind of swath of clients, right? How did you decide what to do next after that?
I was still writing and still working with clients. I will say there was, I used to do just follow-up sessions by Skype before Zoom. So we do Skype calls, but we do like one Skype call after a consultation, after I did a full written analysis of somebody's script. And then one day, this was maybe 20 years ago or something, or wait, when did Zoom come out? 10 years ago? Maybe?
Yeah, maybe 10. I feel like it really came up through the pandemic was whenever it was a household name
Kind
at
of
that
got
point.
big, yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe it was somebody said, do you do Skype coaching? Like, do you do weekly coaching where we have regular meetings over Skype? And so now it's Zoom coaching, And I didn't really do that. I just did consultations on a script by script basis mostly. And so that was when I started to do the individual coaching where you're helping someone develop a piece of material, develop as a writer. And that's way more satisfying because you get to know them, you get to work with them over time, you get to see them develop, and you can help them a lot more. Because, let's face it, nowadays, someone writes a script, sometimes you have to say, you know what? This was a learning tool. This isn't something for the marketplace. I'm sorry to tell you, it's probably not going to get you a manager. It's probably not going to sell, but it was a good step in your evolution. So, learn what you can learn from this now. And if you want to rewrite it with my notes or other people's notes, okay, to go through that rewriting process. But you probably should drop it and move to the next one. And I tell people that more nowadays. And I feel good about that because they're paying me to give them an analysis and not to blow smoke up their butt.
Yeah, and what is it about now where you're able to you're more comfortable with that kind of feedback? What changed in you?
I think probably maybe it was being in LA and seeing the realities of the business of how tough it is. And each year it kind of gets tougher. And as we know, over the past 5-10 years, the spec market has really, really declined. So it isn't as viable now for someone to shop a spec and expect to sell it, So I'm trying to be more realistic with people. And it is so much tougher. And right now we are in a decline in the business, and it's a really tough time, as everybody knows. So I'm more inclined to be more direct and really honest with people, but I'm not telling you not to be a writer or not to pursue your passion. And you can tell me to go to hell and you're going to stick with this script for the next 5 years and you're going to sell it. That's great. And I'm only one opinion. But if I think something isn't going to be viable in the marketplace, I'll tell you, and then you're free to take that however you want.
When did this demand for TV, the story maps for TV drama, start coming into your awareness?
That was probably like between 2008 and 2012. I just found I was watching so much TV. It was like the second golden age of TV. Mad Men, Breaking Bad, Game of Thrones, all these great shows, Walking Dead, Scandal. There were just so many great shows.
You mentioned in your book that you kind of realized that you were watching more television than film.
Yeah.
And I have to say, like in the past X amount of years, the same is true for me too.
Totally.
Yeah. And so you, when that happened, you started to feel like, okay, but there's an opportunity here for me to adapt my structure for television.
Yeah, there was an opportunity. There was a need for it. Like I had clients come to me and say, "Hey, Dan, you wrote this story map for film. Do you have one for TV?" And I didn't. And then I looked out there and I was like, "There's got to be a book with like a detailed beat sheet for TV pilots." And there wasn't really. There were a few coaches who had kind of less detailed beat sheets. Like they'd have like maybe 5 beats for a pilot, for like a 1-hour pilot, but no one had a detailed beat sheet. And so I saw a need for it. And so that's why I developed my beat sheet for television. And so that was the 1-hour beat sheet. And that's my book breaks that down. And since then I've developed a 30-minute beat sheet because not only there aren't as many like straight comedy sitcoms these days, and it was the rise of dramedies were happening. So more 30-minute dramas or 30-minute comedies with a little bit more drama, a little bit more arcs, long-term arcs or mythology. And so I really saw a need there. And so I've since developed a beat sheet for 30-minute dramedies. And I have a webinar for that. You can see at my website, and I work with clients with that. And I have worksheets for that. And I haven't put that into book form yet, but when I do the update of my story map for TV book, I want to have 1 hour and half hour.
Right. Now, take me back to that moment that you decide to do your book for TV drama. What does your workload look like? What is your process like? Are you sitting there? You have a watch list of things that you, because obviously you're doing this because you are so familiar with television, but now with your process, it's like you have to refamiliarize. You kind of have to watch everything with a different lens. Are you taking notes? What's your process like?
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much did scene lists for a bunch of pilots, and then I'm looking for the commonalities, and got as many pilot scripts as I could get. And with TV, I mean, most scripts used to always have act breaks. They would label the act breaks, and you wouldn't label the act breaks in features.
But yeah, like if Breaking Bad, for example, that pilot script you talk about does do that.
Yeah,
it's like
so it's got teaser, yeah, and then it's got Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, Act 4. So you saw that, and those were originally based on commercial breaks, and now they're not as much. But so it was basically easier to approach act structure in a pilot versus a film because it's labeled right there.
So did you feel just some more internal pressure, just knowing that like this is going to be out there, and like you said, it's kind of set in stone, whatever you write. Do you have that in your mind?
So I did feel pressure because there wasn't another beat sheet for TV out there. So I was like, this has to be great. This has to be really good. And I didn't know as many TV writers as I knew feature writers. So I was like, are they going to hate this? Are they going to say I don't know what I'm talking about, you know? And I've tended to get good feedback from. I've never gotten bad feedback from TV writers, and I've only gotten good feedback.
Any feedback from anyone in particular that surprised you? Like, oh, I didn't know this person, my books reached this person. Or
every now and then, I'll hear of an executive or a manager, like your manager, who likes it. I had a CBS executive reach out. He wanted me to coach him on writing his first pilot. A lot of actors have come to me, and what I think it's particularly good with writers who know other mediums, like a feature writer who's never done a pilot. So then they grab my book, Story Maps TV Drama, and it gives them just the template for writing a pilot. It gives them a roadmap. And I found that a lot of actors, too, who want to break into writing really needed it as well. And so I've had a lot of actors come to me for coaching as well. Some who've been in, big things and they're name actors and stuff.
I was going to say, what kind of clients are reaching out to you? It sounds like a wide range of clients. You mentioned an actor, a CBS executive, presumably working writers too. So what are you noticing in terms of who's reaching out to you?
It's really all over the map. I mean, it can be like a guy in Poland. It can be a couple in China. It can be a guy who is writing a comedy for Universal Pictures for a major producer. It can be an actress who's known but wants to take her career to the next level. So,
which really speaks to the reach of your books too. I mean, just what you said, a guy in Poland, someone working
I
right now
hope
here.
so, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's probably the great thing about a book on a universal platform like Amazon is like anybody can find it. You know?
Yeah. And so if someone wanted to and was interested in being coached by you, what would they need to bring? How do these meetings go? Is it like I have an idea, I just don't know how to put it on paper, or where do you typically start with someone?
I mean, it really depends on where they're at. They might have a rough draft, or they might even have a polished draft that they just want to get better. They might have just an idea and they're kind of starting from scratch. They may even know they want to write a new script, but they don't quite have their idea yet. And so we start with 3 log lines. And so I'll say, week 1, come in with 3 log lines for 3 separate ideas, separate projects. And 2 of them could be TV and 1 could be film, or they could all be film, whatever. And we'll workshop those and I'll give you my feedback and we'll talk about them for a few weeks. And we'll talk about like, okay, story-wise, what do you think about this and how do you see this? And then career-wise and commercially, how do you see this as a product that would help your career or help to get you a manager or whatever, you know? Someone like wants to be a horror writer and they specialize in horror, be like, okay, well, this idea sounds like it would cost $100 million, so maybe we'll stay away from that because they don't give $100 million movies to new writers, you know? So maybe we'll focus on one of these other ones, and then I'll ask, what are your favorite movies? What's a comp? What's a comparable template movie for this? And it really helps to talk it out with someone, and it helps to talk it out with someone who has experience in this and has story skills and has seen this over the years. You know, I've worked with a lot of new writers. I've worked with established writers. In some cases, a writer basically wants me to kind of write it with them, like make specific suggestions and go over line by line. I'll be like, okay, this line is like really on the nose. And they'll say, what would you write? And I say, well, just an idea, just a suggestion, but I would write blah, blah, blah. Sometimes they do it word for word and they keep it in their script. And I don't ask for co-writing credit or anything unless I'm like really co-writing with someone. And sometimes they'll just use that as a basic marker and then they'll put their own voice into it.
What are some just common mistakes, blind spots you notice that either emerging writers have, professional writers have?
Well, the first is with concept. Sometimes just the concept and the genre is not something that I think is going to be super viable in the marketplace. I just had 2 clients come to me and they're new writers, they're unestablished, and they were big budget sci-fi movies. And I just had to tell them honestly, it's very hard for a new writer to sell a big budget thing. And they were like quirky comedies as well. One probably could only be done animated, and it's tough to sell an animated spec. Usually animated features are developed in-house, as you know. And then you add in budget, or like they'll write a period piece, and I'll say, you know, it is hard to sell a period piece these days. So start with concept. Theme is a big one. Sometimes I'm like, what is the theme here? Why are you writing this? And that is often the most important question. I'll just be like, why are you writing an action horror movie? And once we plumb the depths of their soul and their creative mind, we find out maybe they weren't using the theme that they thought they were. It's actually about this, you know? So they thought they were writing about denial, but they were writing about belonging, you know? So then that comes out with the process. You have to spend a few weeks talking about it. And in some cases, months and months. And I'll ask them a question and we'll decide, you know what? Maybe the tack you're taking isn't the right tack for you, you know? So concept, theme, and then of course overwriting, you know, I'm great with, you got to trim this down. Talky dialogue scenes, like a 2-person talking heads dialogue scene with a lot of Q&A where they're just asking and answering questions. You know, we've all seen that. Something's just too long. Act 1 goes too long. Clarity's a big one. You know, sometimes I don't know what I'm looking at. Setting up the scene is important. You want to keep it as short as possible, few words as possible at the top of the scene, right after the slug line, interior courtroom day. And I want to know, what am I looking at? Is there a judge behind the bench? Are there two lawyers? Is it packed with people? Or am I just tight on the defendant, without directing and showing? We're not going to say close on unless it's really, really important to your understanding of the moment.
Now I want to move to, you're working with a horror story map, right? Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So I've been focusing a lot on horror because it's such a hot genre right now. And it's interesting because even like more prominent, artistic, elevated filmmakers are making horror now. It just happens to be really hot right now. A lot of like the younger burgeoning filmmakers are making a name in horror rather than other genres because it's really hard to sell and produce like a drama these days. I know producers who are like, I just can't sell a drama, for whatever reason. So I've been focusing on horror, and I realized that, so I wanted to do a class to focus on it. And I realized I have 4 friends who have all had good horror movies that they've produced, written, directed, or all 3. And they had been advisors to my students before in my past, what I call Story Maps Masterclass. So I was like, this would be a great group, and I'll have them be guest speakers, and we'll do Zoom sessions for 4 weeks in which they come in and my writers can ask them all sorts of questions. And then best of all, they're going to give my writers notes on their actual log lines. So it's specific, which is something you don't always get, especially if you don't know a producer or you don't pay them directly for it. That like real analysis of your log line, like down to the word. And it really helps to have, not only do they look at it and they write notes, and then I copy and paste that into the classroom. I copy and paste that into the Google Classroom for the students, but then we do a live Zoom session and they look at rewrites and we talk about it. And
That's huge.
Writer can ask questions. Yeah.
What are you noticing when you're breaking them down?
Genre niche is very important. There's so many niches of horror: home invasion horror, elevated horror, family horror, slasher, whatever. So I'm noticing people do like to focus on their particular niche. So a writer should know their comps. They should know what relatively recent films and what classic films used that template. There should be some kind of primal fear in there that it's based on, and that's what makes it universal. So, and if you're thinking about horror, think about, well, what scares me? I have a recurring nightmare of a giant like tsunami wave coming towards me, which is also something James Cameron had as well. And that's why he did The Abyss, right? That was the ending, The Abyss. Anyway, but
He's worked a lot with water. Now that I think of it, James Cameron.
Yeah. But everybody has those fears and those recurring nightmares, right? So you might want to start with that. And the more universal, the better. So something like The Substance appealed to a lot of women because it was about the fear of aging, and then you become irrelevant in society, in patriarchal society, and you lose your looks and just all of the anxieties around that. And they were totally riffing on that in that movie, There's the fear of random violence or random killers, like a slasher movie like Halloween or something like that. So if you can start with a primal fear, and then you want to have some kind of template, like story template, whether it's a public domain story like Frankenstein, or it's a myth, or it's riffing off of a classic horror film like Get Out. Jordan Peele was very inspired by films like Rosemary's Baby and The Wicker Man. Like they had the very similar slow burn structure.
I haven't heard the comp to Rosemary's Baby, but when you said that, that's perfect.
Yeah.
It is. It's almost like with Get Out and Rosemary's Baby, there's this like, there's this people conspiring around you.
Yeah,
Or at least
yeah.
it feels like that, but you're not quite sure. And so it's this emotional claustrophobic kind of feeling, right?
Yeah,
It's a
something's
great
going
comp.
on. What is going on? And it takes
Yeah.
90 minutes to get there.
Okay, so that horror niche. So it's not. Yeah, you're right, because horror genre
Subgenre, basically, what you call it.
is so vast that it's like what kind of and starting with a primal fear, I think is fantastic. And structurally, are you noticing that they still adhere to your major beats that you've come to map out in other films?
Basically, yes, but there are actually more low budget experimental movies that are breaking out in horror. Things like Long Legs or It Follows. I haven't seen the Terrifier movies, but there is perhaps less of an adherence to classic structure. You can maybe experiment more. Something like Hereditary, Midsummer. There's probably a little bit more wiggle room with experimentation because the main thing is scares, it's tension, it's escalating conflict, and the mystery. You have to have a great mystery. Like in Get Out, what is going on? Why does everybody seem to be in on something that Chris isn't in on?
Yes. Are there genres that are tougher to break down than others, or that you find have a little more wiggle room when it comes to structure?
Maybe comedy, but it not really. I mean, it's pretty much that's the great thing about my story map is it pretty much applies to every genre.
It does. When you kind of hesitated for a second, why do you feel like maybe there's some wiggle room? Is it just because the pacing of comedies and the way comedy is just received by an audience that there's some malleability?
I think with comedy and horror, it's the jokes and it's the fear. It's the scares. It's not so much rooted in maybe the classic character arc. Like comedy's tough to break into these days. I broke down Barbie for the updated edition of my book, and I watched it 3 to 4 times. I really analyzed it. I did a full scene list with a ton of detail. Every time I watch it and every time I go over that scene list, I find something new, and it really is expertly crafted. It's really well-made film. And a lot of the criticisms of it out there just aren't valid. If you go back and look at the film, everything was intentional. Like, for example, there was the famous monologue from America Ferrera about how tough it is to be a woman, right? And so many men, raise their heckles over it. And, it was so great to see all the men losing their shit online about it. But it did kind of seem like a departure. It kind of seemed like commentary from the director, right? Like almost like they're looking in the screen and saying, it's so tough to be a woman and here's why. But in the movie, it works because Barbie's final decision is to become human, to become a real woman in the real world, which is tough. So this character is saying, are you crazy? This is how tough it is to be a woman. And Barbie makes the decision anyway. She does the tough thing, which is to leave her safe, perfect Barbie land environment and go to the patriarchal society, which is tougher. That's the whole thing with the movie is that ending. When I first saw Barbie, I didn't quite get why the ending worked, but if you really look at thematically, there's so much to it. There's so many layers. There was this whole layer that I found where it was almost like the film was a metaphor for a young girl growing past playing with dolls. Like it was a metaphor for a young girl throwing away her dolls and putting them in a drawer and deciding, I'm going to be an adult now. I'm going to grow up. And it was like the whole movie kind of was a metaphor for that. And that was really brilliant. And I think that's why it spoke to so many women.
It's a $1 billion movie.
Yeah, it's the biggest film in Warner Brothers history. So, and that's another thing when I see like guys complaining about it or people complain, or even, not just guys, it's women too. Like I've seen women say it's not a real feminist movie or it's ridiculous or whatever. And I'm like, well, somebody liked it because it made more money than any of the Harry Potter movies. You know, it made more money than any Warner Brothers movie in history. So obviously, it cracked the zeitgeist.
Hearing that a movie about Barbie is going to be made, I mean, no one is excited about that, except, of course, maybe children. But then you hear Greta Gerwig, Noah Baumbach's attached to it. Starts, okay,
Smart
maybe this is
people.
going to be a little bit different. Like they're gonna, and then to Mattel's, credit and the studio's credit, it's like, oh, they were able to say something,
Yeah.
and which speaks to your point that really allowed it to have an incredible impact
Yeah,
on the culture.
And that was a property that went through a lot of creative teams over the years. It was in development for a number of years. And, they had this creative team did their take, but that didn't work or they didn't greenlight that one. So for some reason they greenlit the Greta Gerwig, Noah Baumbach take. And obviously that was a great idea because it worked.
Yes. Is there, just on that note, a film that you think structurally is just so fantastic, but it's underappreciated or is worth a second look?
I looked at The Silence of the Lambs again last year, and I hadn't seen it in years. And it is such a solid movie with such solid storytelling. Everything is set up. Everything is motivated. And it's just clear. And you don't see that a lot today. And one of my main problems with a lot of modern filmmakers is just ambiguity. Like in The Silence of the Lambs, when we cut to the FBI headquarters at Quantico, they cut to an exterior shot and there's a sign saying FBI, Quantico. And I'm like, I miss that. I miss the knowing where the location is as opposed to cutting into a interior somewhere and we're watching a show and me and my wife look at each other like, where are they again? Is this the next day? Is this 2 hours later? Like what's happening? It just happened with something we were watching last night. And I'm sick of being confused, like good, solid, classic storytelling is where you're at. And every now and then, it's okay to have some ambiguity and to keep people thinking, and Kubrick did that. Not everything makes sense in a lot of classic movies. And at the, as you're walking out of the theater, you're still thinking about it, talking about it, and that's okay. But I don't want to be confused and in the dark 10 times through the span of a movie or a TV show,
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Kubrick, who it's one of my favorite filmmakers. Has there been a film where you're trying to break it down because maybe you love the film, but you're like, I just can't quite fit it or find the that it adheres to the structure that you're looking for?
There's been a few films where I'm like, I don't know exactly why this works, but it does. And maybe something like a Kubrick film would be a good example, like 2001.
I was thinking the same. I'm sure if you
so
look for
slow, it's so ambiguous.
Yeah.
But for some reason, it works, and it's a great piece of art.
Do you have any deeper thoughts like that on where that comes from?
I think it's we've internalized things over the years, maybe because of drama, maybe because it started with like stage drama and then movies and then TV. TV is an obvious example. Well, TV shows were 30 minutes or 1 hour, the time slot. But I think it probably happened before then because like you'll look at an older movie like a Rear Window or Hitchcock movie or something or Wizard of Oz, and there usually is about a 30-minute act one. Older movies tend to be a little bit longer. There might be like Star Wars has a really long act one, right? It doesn't have like a 45, 48-minute act one or something like that.
Right. And it's also juggling multiple narratives.
Yeah.
Multiple, you're not just staying with one character. It's cutting to the villain, it's cutting back to the hero.
Yeah. But for some reason, over time, I think we've internalized a clock, which is like 10 to 15-minute intervals.
Yes.
And that was one of the things that I loved the most when I saw Sunset Boulevard, which was in, I think, 1950.
Yep.
It exactly conforms to a 110-minute story map, Dan Calvisi structure. I was so excited to find that. And it's such an amazing classic film. But it's such a tight structure, and it's exactly like a modern movie, which is pretty crazy to think.
With the rise of streaming, and obviously the advertising model has changed because there's no more commercials dictating act breaks. Do you see the format, the structure evolving, or is it still pretty much intact?
It's mostly intact to like 1 hour dramas are mostly teaser plus 4 acts or teaser plus 5 acts. And I don't break down every show these days, so
Yeah.
I'm sure there's variations. But there is more experimentation, definitely, in TV these days, sometimes to the detriment of the show. Like a really good bottle episode is great, where it's like a standalone episode where it exists outside the normal continuity of the show, or maybe it's a flashback and it shows like the origin story of a character, or, something offbeat for that show. But too many shows are doing those bottle episodes now, and they don't need to.
I'm thinking of like The Fly from Breaking Bad, where they're in the lab,
They're stuck in the lab.
stuck in the lab,
Yeah.
and there's a fly flying
Yeah.
around, and they spend the whole episode looking for it.
Yeah.
That's an example of what you're talking about.
Yeah. Or The Last of Us, there was the two gay guys
Yes.
kind of in the apocalypse. There was
Yes,
that.
that was like episode 4 or something of season 1 or 3. Right.
Yeah.
Right. That was an example of a flashback episode. Right.
Yeah. And then the best one, I think, was in The Bear. It was the Christmas Eve dinner in The Bear. And they had all these guest stars like Jamie Lee Curtis and John Bernthal, and John Mulaney pops up. Better Call Saul. Bob Odenkirk just pops up. And they had all these cameos. And it was this great self-contained story. I think it's about the 5 fishes, I think, because she's making the meal of the 5 fishes on Christmas Eve, which was an Italian tradition.
Yeah.
I think it's called Fishes.
Okay.
And it's just an amazing standalone little mini film.
This is something I ask every guest. It's called the rule I break. Every industry has rules, and some are there for a reason, and some are just begging to be broken. So what's a rule in your field that you don't follow or believe in?
So here, I thought about that, and there's a rule I would like to break, and I only did it once, and that is that when a manager or producer asks for unsolicited submissions, like every now and then on social media, a manager will say, "Hey, you know what, guys? I'm gonna accept some unsolicited submissions. I want to see what's out there," and they always say, "Just send me a single email with one log line, and make it the log line of your best script." And that bugs me because then that writer has to, first of all, kind of guess what they're looking for. Like a manager, they're not looking for everything, right? There's probably certain niches, certain budget levels, certain relationships that they have that do break down to certain types of projects, okay? So, and the thing is, a writer develops over time, and I don't think a writer should be penned in by one genre. A good writer, a good screenwriter can write in multiple genres, multiple budget levels, and over time they develop different material. Okay, so I see that managers and producers today, they want a writer to come to them fully formed, focused only on one genre, and only show them one log line for one script. And if they don't like that log line, pass, and they'll never hear from that writer again. And I don't like that, because that writer may have 2 other scripts that would be better for that producer, that would be better for that manager, that they could do more with, and they see more potential. So I would like to see a manager producer say, send me 3 log lines for your 3 best scripts, okay? Because you may have like, I have 4 half-hour dramedy pilots that I wrote. One of them is a high school story about a girl in high school. So it's kind of like a YA show, if you will. But that's not the thing that I normally write. That's kind of an outlier. But that happens to be the piece of material that I've gotten the most response from, right? But it's not what I want to write. I do not want to be labeled, oh, Dan writes on teen shows with female protagonists. But if I send that logline to a manager, they're going to think that's what I do. And if they don't like that logline, they're going to pass on me, and they're never going to hear from me again. They're never going to want to hear from me again. And I've had that where I've referred writers to managers and they just totally ghosted them. And I was like, why are you ghosting them? Like, I told you reasons why this writer has potential, and you have more than one logline, give them a whirl, give it a try. So I'd like to see people invest a little bit more time in finding out who a writer is, what material do they have? Because as we know, as a writer, you may think this project's the big hit I have. This is going to be the big blockbuster hit. But then a manager sits down and says, tell me about your other scripts. And the third thing you mentioned, they go, wait, I want to know about that. I want to read that script, not this one that you thought was going to be the blockbuster.
Before we go, I like to do a rapid fire round. What was the last book you read?
It was a novel written by a Black female writer. And it was interesting because I didn't know that it was going to end up being about the industry, but it did end up being about the industry. She was, the protagonist was a writer. It was written in the first person. And was it written in the first person? I can't quite remember, sorry. But she ends up getting her story ripped off by a TV producer. So there's an interesting turn in there. And she kind of learns a lesson about the industry. And she was kind of lying to a friend of hers who was an established TV producer that she was doing this because she didn't want him to know that she was kind of working in a genre and stuff. So it ended up being about the industry, which was interesting.
What's a movie you love rewatching? With all the movies that you watch for your work, what's something that you love going back to?
Well, like I said, probably The Silence of the Lambs. It's just very watchable.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
If it wasn't this, what's another career field you could see yourself in?
Maybe comic books, drawing comic books, some kind of visual graphic design.
Worst piece of advice you've ever received?
This is kind of random, but I was doing years ago when I was actually thinking about getting out of the industry. And I was in like a business development program where you develop your resume. And this particular class said, don't put any formatting in your resume. Have everything left justified in Courier font because they're just going to feed it into the OCR thing where they're going to read it for keywords and just fill every single keyword you can possibly think of in your resume. And it just made it look really boring. And I think that was bad advice. But I mean, it's very random, but
that's funny. Yeah, I've never heard of that. I know I see resumes in the industry, and at least in entertainment, they're quite visual. So they're definitely not left justified Courier font.
Yeah, yeah.
You said that you were thinking about getting out of the industry years ago?
This is when I transitioned from New York back to California. And I was actually thinking about, first I was thinking about maybe advertising or business. And then I was thinking about going to visual effects, which was visual. Like I took some classes in Maya and 3D software. And so I really enjoyed that. And I thought, oh, maybe I'll go into that area. But I actually got intimidated because I was in these classes with like 19-year-olds who grew up with computer chips in their brain, and they were so good at it and they were so fast. And I'm like, I'm going to be competing with them to get a job at ILM or something. So I got kind of talked myself out of it, and I went back to script coaching and writing anyway, which is my passion. That's my passion anyway. So I'm glad I did.
And the rest is history, right?
Yeah, it worked out. So.
Yeah. And finally, best piece of advice you've ever received?
Probably don't discount yourself, because I have a thing where I either make fun of myself or I discount my achievements, and that's not attractive at all. People want to work with confident people, and I might be feeling down, be like, I'm such a failure and I haven't done anything lately. And my wife will be like, you've done this and this and this and this, and here's why. And you run your own business and you wrote books and all these things. And I'm like, well, maybe you're right. Maybe I did do something decent, But I've had people tell me, like, don't discount yourself. Like you throw out these negative comments sometimes about yourself, or you don't value your achievements and stuff. So I try to do that, try to kind of project more self-esteem, even though it can be tough because I've got those little demons in my head with the imposter syndrome,
I think we all have that. And I think that's great advice. And little did you know, just randomly reaching out to me, that your book is on my shelf.
Yeah,
and I went to your website and I was like, that's the what? So
that's another lesson. It's like you have to reach out to people You can't just sit at home, which is easy now with social media. You can't just troll social media 10 hours a day and expect things to come to you. You have to take a risk and reach out. Like I almost didn't email you. I'm like, he's got this podcast going and he has enough guests. He doesn't need another guest. But you never know. You what is a thing? You only hit the
targets you shoot for, or
in baseball you never hit the ball you don't swing at. Like, so take a swing.
It's true, especially for all of us in the creative industry, is like dealing with rejection, dealing with the imposter syndrome, the voices in our head. But just to do it, just to do the thing is so important. And you just don't know how the dots will connect.
Yeah.
Just like with what you've built in your career, you don't know until you look back and you go, that happened.
And finishing something and putting it out there is really necessary. And that's what leads to things, like my books have gotten me a lot of clients, and then that improves my network. And then I meet people who know them, and then that everything dovetails from that. Networking, it's who you know, and you know someone, they know someone, they know someone, and you end up getting a lot of opportunities. But if I hadn't put out that book first and somebody hadn't seen that, then they wouldn't have thought to contact me and hire me, and things just branch out.
That's
from
right.
there.
Yeah. Well, this was just an absolute pleasure talking to you, Daniel. Yeah, thank you for coming on and sharing your story.
Thanks a lot, Brandon.